A ridge of forests and frozen rivers west of Moscow became a place the Eastern Front tried to forget. For 15 months, armies slammed into the same narrow corridors around Rzhev, often gaining yards, paying in divisions, and then doing it again. The fights didn't end with a cinematic encirclement or a flag-raising moment. They ended with a decision. Germany quietly abandoned the Bulge to save what could still be saved, because by early 1943, even holding ground could bankrupt an army. And the Red Army's payoff wasn't a single victory headline, it was a hard-earned upgrade in how modern war actually works. Rzhev sits on the Upper Volga, on the roads and rail lines that knit Western Russia to Moscow. In 1942, that geography mattered like a loaded weapon. Whoever controlled the corridor controlled the easiest approach routes toward the Soviet capital. The Rzhev salient was not one battle. It was a long, overlapping campaign: winter offensives, summer offensives, counterblows, failed breakthroughs, repeated resets, stretching from early 1942 into March 1943. And the reason it became so punishing is simple: it was close enough to Moscow to feel existential, but far enough from decisive supply hubs that every offensive turned into a logistics test under fire. For the Soviet Union, the stakes were more than a line on a map. After the crisis outside Moscow in 1941, Soviet planners faced two linked problems: protect the capital's approaches and regain the initiative without wasting the rebuilt industrial base that had been uprooted and moved east. The Rzhev Bulge threatened both. It pinned Soviet armies in place and kept the psychological pressure on Moscow alive, an enemy dagger that never fully went away. For Germany, the salient offered leverage. In theory, it fixed Soviet formations in the center, protected key rail junctions farther west, and preserved options for future offensives. But in theory is where Rzhev lived. In practice, Army Group Center was maintaining a huge exposed forward bulge, feeding its supplies, replacing losses, rotating exhausted units, while the overall war was shifting against Germany in manpower and production. But here's the twist: Rzhev became a battlefield where neither side could afford to be right. If the Soviets attacked and failed, they bled strength they needed elsewhere. If the Germans held and stayed, they risked being trapped in a forward position they could no longer support indefinitely. That is what makes the salient such a revealing case: strategy trapped inside the grind of attrition. Zoom in on the terrain for a second. This isn't open steppe. It's forest, swamps, river lines, and small villages connected by a limited road network that turns into mud in thaw and ice in deep winter. Under those conditions, timing becomes a weapon. A thaw can stop tanks as effectively as a minefield. A hard freeze can create new crossing routes and suddenly make impassable terrain negotiable. And when both sides know that, offensives start to look less like a clean plan and more like a race to exploit a weather window before it closes. That's why the Rzhev fighting repeatedly turned into what soldiers on both sides recognized as a cycle: assault, partial penetration, counterattack, stabilization, rebuild, then the cycle starts again. The Red Army kept trying to crack the salient because the strategic prize remained. The Germans kept fighting because giving it up felt like inviting the next threat closer to their rail lifelines. But here's the twist: by 1942, the Eastern Front was no longer a contest of brilliant maneuvers. It was increasingly a contest of replacement systems: how fast you could refill units, repair equipment, and keep formations coherent after weeks of losses. That's the invisible battlefield Rzhev exposes. By late 1942, Soviet planning had multiple urgent aims at once. Stalingrad dominated headlines, but Soviet leaders were also thinking about Leningrad and about eliminating the Rzhev Bulge opposite Moscow. The center mattered because it tied down German forces that might otherwise reinforce elsewhere, and because the salient itself remained a threat vector. This brings us to the moment most viewers have heard of, but rarely in context: Operation Mars, launched in late November 1942. Mars was designed to smash the Rzhev salient, and in its most ambitious vision, to break Army Group Center's position in a way that could unravel the German center. The timing, late 1942, was not an accident. The Soviets were already attempting the Stalingrad encirclement, Operation Uranus. Mars would widen the pressure and complicate German decision-making across the front. Operation Mars was massive, and it was brutal. The key point isn't a single arrow on a map. It's what happened when Soviet forces collided with prepared German defenses and flexible counterattacks. In one assessment referenced in a U.S. Army professional publication, Mars was called off after about a month of fighting, producing only minor frontline shifts at very high cost. Figures cited there describe roughly 100,000 Soviet dead and 235,000 wounded for the operation. Now, be careful with any single set of casualty numbers. Rzhev accounting varies by source, time frame, and definitions, killed versus missing versus wounded versus sick. The safe historical takeaway is the shape of the outcome. Mars failed to deliver the operational breakthrough the Soviets wanted, and it reinforced a lesson that would echo into 1943. Mass alone doesn't guarantee maneuver success unless coordination, artillery planning, and logistics are synchronized under pressure. But here's the twist: a failure can still be strategically useful. Even when the Soviets didn't achieve the clean breakthrough, the pressure around Rzhev contributed to German exhaustion in the center. Units were worn down, reserves were consumed, and commanders had to plan for the next blow while still surviving the current one. That slow drain mattered, because by early 1943, Germany was trying to stabilize after Stalingrad and manage growing threats across multiple theaters. You can see the broader strategic climate in contemporary U.S. Army historical analysis of 1943. Germany's ability to set the terms of the war was shrinking, and the Eastern Front was increasingly about holding together under pressure, not launching sweeping offensives at will. By early 1943, the Rzhev salient was still there, but the logic of keeping it was collapsing. The German army was hemorrhaging strength across the front, and the center could not be treated as a static, safe zone. The question became blunt: is the salient a shield, or is it a trap? Mini cliffhanger, end of Module 1. And this is where the story turns upside down. The Rzhev campaign doesn't climax with the Soviets finally breaking through. It climaxes with German commanders deciding the position is too expensive to keep, then trying to pull an entire army group sector out of a forward bulge without letting the Red Army turn the retreat into a disaster. The moment Germany chooses to leave is the moment the salient becomes most dangerous, because retreats are when fronts crack. In Module 1, the Rzhev salient emerged as a strategic dagger pointed toward Moscow, and a liability that consumed armies. The Red Army kept attacking because the stakes were existential and because pressure in the center shaped the entire Eastern Front. Operation Mars in late 1942 showed how deadly prepared defenses could be when coordination and logistics didn't align. Now the decisive shift arrives. Germany chooses to withdraw, not because the Soviets win a single dramatic breakthrough, but because the salient has become an unaffordable position in a war Germany is starting to lose. The German solution had a name: a planned withdrawal from the Rzhev salient in late February into March 1943, commonly associated with Operation Buffalo, the Buffalo Movement. The heart of the decision, as described in a U.S. Army Professional Volumes case study of the withdrawal, was the need to abandon the salient to create urgently needed reserves. In other words, shorten the line, reduce exposure, and free combat power for a future that was arriving faster than Germany could prepare. But here's the twist: leaving can be harder than staying. A forward bulge is dangerous because it can be attacked from multiple sides. A retreat from a bulge is dangerous because the enemy can try to cut the roads behind you. And around Rzhev, the Soviet command had every reason to attempt exactly that: turn the withdrawal into an encirclement, or at least into a rout that would break German cohesion. This is where the campaign reveals its invisible center of gravity: cohesion. A retreat under pressure is not primarily an engineering problem or a map problem. It's a unit problem. Can formations hold discipline when they're moving backward, tired, and under constant threat of being overtaken? Can rear guards maintain a line long enough for the main body to slip away? Can supply and wounded evacuation keep pace with movement? The Army University Press chapter focused on the German 7th Infantry Division during the withdrawal emphasizes that the order to abandon the salient came after months of grinding attrition that weakened German units across the front. It describes preliminary investigations into evacuating the position as early as autumn 1942, and notes that as the German position deteriorated across the breadth of the front in early 1943, German military leadership finally persuaded Hitler to abandon the salient, preparing for a March withdrawal. Notice what's implied there. This wasn't a sudden panic reaction. It was a delayed acceptance of a strategic reality. And that delay matters, because it shaped how the withdrawal had to be executed, fast enough to avoid catastrophe, but structured enough to avoid turning into a stampede. At the same time, the Soviet side was changing. U.S. Army historical analysis of the broader 1943 fighting emphasizes how Soviet operational methods were evolving, less dependent on a single, perfect, encirclement and more capable of sustained pressure, repeated offensives, and artillery-heavy breakthroughs. It also notes that Soviet commanders were adapting German concepts to Soviet strengths and limitations, leaning toward cumulative offensives that wore the enemy down blow by blow. But here's the twist: adaptation doesn't mean instant mastery. Around Rzhev, Soviet forces faced a moving target, literally. As German troops withdrew, the tactical problem shifted from breaking fixed defenses to catching and cutting columns on the move. That's a different kind of operation. It demands rapid reconnaissance, flexible control, and logistics that can support pursuit over wrecked infrastructure and contested roads. And this is where the Rzhev campaign's quiet ending becomes its most important lesson. The German withdrawal succeeded in avoiding a Stalingrad-style encirclement in the center. That fact alone tells you something about the German army's remaining competence in early 1943. Even in a losing war, it could still execute difficult operational maneuvers under threat. But it also tells you something else. Germany was now trading geography for survival. Giving up Rzhev changed the geometry of the front. A shortened line reduced the manpower required just to hold positions. It released formations that could be shifted toward anticipated crises, like the coming summer battles and the need to rebuild an operational reserve after the winter's disasters. This is the key payoff. The Rzhev salient wasn't abandoned because it didn't matter. It was abandoned because it mattered too much and cost too much to keep. From the Soviet perspective, the withdrawal still delivered an outcome Soviet planners wanted: the removal of a long-standing threat axis near Moscow and the recovery of devastated territory. Even when the final exit was initiated by Germany, the results still reshaped Soviet strategic freedom of action in the central sector. But here's the twist: the real Soviet win was not just the map. It was the laboratory. Rzhev was an arena where the Red Army's weaknesses were exposed repeatedly: coordination, tempo control, bridging supply gaps, integrating artillery with maneuver, and where those weaknesses were forced to improve because the costs of not improving were unbearable. If you want a straight line from Rzhev to later Soviet success, it runs through method. In 1943, Soviet forces would demonstrate stronger operational art, especially when massed artillery, better timed offensives, and improving command systems supported the plan. The U.S. Army historical discussion of 1943 highlights Soviet growth beyond its early war apprenticeship, even while acknowledging persistent problems at lower levels and the limits that still constrained deep maneuver. So why is Rzhev forgotten? Partly because it resists simple storytelling. There's no single battle name that contains the whole experience. It's a series of operations, many of them costly and incomplete. It's also because its most decisive moment is an enemy withdrawal, dramatic in consequence, not in spectacle. And yet, memory eventually returned to the landscape. Modern commemoration around Rzhev reflects the scale of sacrifice and the long shadow the campaign left behind. The unveiling of the Rzhev Memorial to the Soviet soldier in 2020 shows how the region's wartime meaning continues to be publicly marked and remembered. Final payoff. Rzhev matters because it shows what attrition really is. Not just casualties, but the slow destruction of options. The Red Army paid an enormous price to keep Germany pinned, to protect Moscow's approaches, and to learn how to coordinate modern firepower and maneuver under extreme conditions. Germany paid a different price: the gradual realization that even well-held ground can become a strategic debt. And in March 1943, that debt came due, Germany chose survivability over symbolism, and the Eastern Front's center shifted from a dagger point into a shortened line built for a war of endurance. Rzhev is the kind of campaign where the biggest turning point isn't an explosion, it's a decision to stop paying for a position that's draining the entire front. If that quiet withdrawal changed how you see the Eastern Front, drop a like, share this with a fellow World War II history fan, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. Comment prompt: which mattered more at Rzhev, Soviet persistence, or the German choice to abandon the salient? Video description: Rzhev Battles 1942-43 explained. The overlooked Eastern Front campaign near Moscow that turned attrition into strategy. Operation Mars, the Rzhev salient, and Germany's March 1943 withdrawal, why it mattered. In this documentary-style breakdown, you'll learn how the Rzhev salient west of Moscow shaped Soviet operational learning and forced German Army Group Center into a high-stakes trade, hold ground or preserve combat power. We cover the Eastern Front context, Soviet offensives, Operation Mars, German defensive doctrine, the March 1943 Buffalo withdrawal, and how this grinding campaign influenced the road to Kursk, Soviet artillery doctrine, and long war logistics. Without sensationalism, just clear history. In this video we cover where Rzhev is and why the corridor mattered for Moscow. What the Rzhev salient actually was, not one battle. The campaign's timeline, early 1942 through March 1943. Why terrain, weather, and roads shaped every offensive. Soviet strategic aims in the center versus Stalingrad and Leningrad pressures. Operation Mars, NOV, DEC 1942 goals and outcome. Why prepared German defenses punished Soviet breakthroughs. The hidden battlefield, replacements, cohesion, and logistics. Why German leadership chose to abandon the salient in 1943. How a planned withdrawal avoids encirclement, and why it's so risky. What Rzhev taught the Red Army about artillery and coordination. How the campaign changed the geometry of the Eastern Front. Sources and further reading. U.S. Army/Hyperwar, Earl of Ziemke, Stalingrad to Berlin, the German defeat in the East. Army University Press, U.S. Army CAC Armies in Retreat, Chaos, Cohesion and Consequences, includes chapter on Rzhev withdrawal. Army University Press chapter, The German 7th Infantry Division and Retreat from the Rzhev Salient, February-March 1943. Encyclopedia Britannica, Rzhev, Geography and Wartime Context. Halion and Company, Publisher Notes and related scholarship pointers on Rzhev studies. David Glantz, recommended Zhukov's greatest defeat, the Red Army's epic disaster in Operation Mars, 1942. David Glantz, recommended after Stalingrad, the Red Army's winter offensive 1942-43. Jeffrey Roberts, recommended Stalin's wars, from World War to Cold War, 1939-1953. Kremlin Event Archive, Commemoration Context, Rzhev Memorial Unveiling, 2020. Additional context, U.S. Army analysis of Soviet operational evolution in 1943, within Ziemke's broader Eastern Front narrative. This video is a historical summary, sources listed above. If you want more deep dive campaigns like Rzhev, subscribe, and comment. Which decision shaped the outcome more, Operation Mars or the March 1943 withdrawal?